Good morning. I'm Logan, Engle, and I want to welcome you to First Baptist Church of Erwin's online Sunday morning Bible study. I'm so glad you've chosen to join us today. Perhaps you're watching this live on Facebook or YouTube, or maybe you found this on your Facebook news feed later. Regardless of how you're finding us or how you came to join us in Bible study this morning, I want to welcome you today, and we're so glad that you're here. To give us a little bit of context, many of you attend our worship service, or maybe you watch online, but our pastor Kobe started a sermon series last week entitled First Thessalonians, Hope for a Hostile World. And we're going to be looking at this letter that Paul writes to the Thessalonian church more closely, both in worship on Sunday morning through his sermon, but also in our Bible study each Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. So mark your calendars. Next week, someone will be back to continue this study, or go back to last week and you can see Jamie Snyder's study about 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. So this morning we're going to be looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, specifically verses 1 through 8. The chapter is a little bit longer than that, but we're going to look at those first verses in the first half of the chapter. As you'll recall, Thessalonians is one of the first letters that Paul wrote to any church, or that we have canonized in the New Testament. It's important to note that Luke writes in Acts about the evangelization of Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17. We know that Paul often went to cities that had synagogues, and Thessalonica was a very diverse city. It was located on the Ignatian Way, which was essentially like a major interstate. It would be like I-26 coming right through the middle of the town. This made it very diverse. It was a port city as well, so there were a lot of people coming to Thessalonica from a lot of different places. But we learn that when Paul, Silas, and Timothy first came to Thessalonica, there was a riot that was started as a result of their teaching. And that primarily came from the Jewish population there. We know the Romans had a serious intolerance of social unrest, and this forced Paul and his companions to leave the city very quickly. So Paul leaves behind a very young church, very young in their faith, very young in their leadership. And we know from that story that they were experiencing persecution because of their faith and their beliefs. So Paul is writing this letter to show some deep concern and compassion, but also to remind them of leadership, positive Christian leadership in their community, and the leadership that he had shown them, and we're going to talk more about that. So this letter is as a result of the good report that he receives from Timothy. Sending Timothy there, he's not able to return, but he sends Timothy in his place. Timothy gives him this report that the Thessalonican church is thriving. They're full of thanksgiving and faith and love and hope at the prospect of what their young church can do in the community. Paul is going to present some concerns in this text. I'm going to read it to you in just a moment. So if you want to grab your scripture, whether that is your Bible or some type of Bible app, whatever you'd like to do. But he's talking particularly in this text about his motives in ministry, his leadership style, and he's going to use a rhetorical approach in the passage to defend his position, both his ministerial position there at the church of Thessalonica, or to define his role. And perhaps you've been asked, you've been in a situation, whether it's at church or in some other context, to defend your actions or your role in a particular situation. So Paul is going to do this, explaining his role as a visiting church planter and an evangelist. And he's going to use that to help describe his leadership style. And we're going to find that Paul is depicting himself here, and we can believe it to be true because he's probably using a scribe. And one commentary I read said, what scribe would write these things down about Paul if they were not true? But he's a compassionate and a collaborative leader who's working alongside these new believers and this new church, and expects really no special treatment as a result. So if you'll grab your text, I'm going to read this. I'm going to read it to you once in the New International Version, and then I'm going to read it to you again in the Message, because I think sometimes hearing it in a little bit of a different tone and tenor is helpful for us. We use the Message a lot. Kobe uses that frequently. I have a parallel text, so I have it in both translations here in my Bible, which really, the Message is more of a paraphrase But I think it helps to give us a more modern perspective of what we're reading, and maybe it will help us to better understand how it can apply to our own situation in our own churches and in our communities. So first I'll read it in the New International Version. If you want to join me, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. You know we never use flattery, nor do we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is your witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or from anyone else. Even though, as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And then I'm going to read the passage to you in the Message paraphrase. So, friends, it's obvious that our visit to you was no waste of time. We had just been given rough treatment in Philippi, as you know, but that did not slow us down. We were sure of ourselves in God and went right ahead and said our piece, presenting God's message to you, defiant of the opposition. God tested us thoroughly to make sure we were qualified to be trusted with this message. Be assured that when we speak to you, we're not after crowd approval, only God approval. Since we've been put through that battery of tests, you're guaranteed both we and the message are free of error, mixed motives, or hidden agendas. We never used words to butter you up. No one knows that better than you. And God knows we never used words as a smokescreen to take advantage of you. Even though we had some standing as Christ's apostles, we never threw our weight around or tried to come across as important with you or anyone else. We weren't aloof with you. We took you just as you were. We were never patronizing, never condescending, but we cared for you the way a mother cares for her children. We loved you dearly, not content to just pass on the message. We wanted to give you our hearts, and we did. So when we look at this text, as I said, we see the heart of Paul as a minister. And you'll be reminded in last week's text, which Jamie Snyder taught us about, and Kobe as well, that Paul talks about being an imitator. And they are being an imitator of Paul and being an imitator of God. So he's reminding them, you are to imitate this behavior. This is how I treated you, and this is how you should treat others. The FedEx man is here, you guys, just in case. Maybe he'll hear this and want to join us. In verses 1 and 2, we see, for you know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered, and we had been treated outrageously in Philippi. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. So Paul is saying here, I came to serve. I didn't make demands to you. And you yourselves know this to be true. So he's reminding them of what occurred in the past. He links this to chapter 1, and he reminds them about the persecution that they faced. They left very quickly. I mentioned that earlier in Thessalonica, and there was a lot of confusion afoot. Sometimes in a vacuum, when leaders leave, we know that people start talking. They start talking about why they left, what happened. Maybe they make accusatory remarks. And so there was confusion afoot in Thessalonica about what had happened there at the church. So one reading of this text says that perhaps these enemies in Thessalonica, these folks who had rioted and who had given the Romans cause to drive them out of the community, they were maybe trying to discredit Paul and his apostles' reputation in the community in his absence. They may have thought he was a coward for leaving, but he says here, you yourselves know, you know who I am. So no matter what anyone tries to tell you, you know me, you know my heart. And so he could be answering to insidious attacks against his reputation. Barclay, who's a scholar, points out these following things that could have been used against Paul. He has a police record. He's untrustworthy. Maybe he's delusional about his own abilities. Perhaps he has impure motives, or he's trying to deliberately deceive. He's preaching to please others, not God, and we see a very clear counter of this in the text. Maybe he's just a mercenary. He's just out to get what he can materially and move on to the next city and do the same thing. Maybe he wants personal glory. Maybe he's a dictator, an autocratic leader who only wants what he wants. So Barclay says maybe these statements were being said about Paul in his absence. Perhaps some of those adjectives I mentioned, those descriptors, might be used to describe some of the televangelists we see today, whether it's fair or unfair depending upon the person, that they're in it for the money, that they're in it for the personal glory, that they want their names flashed on television or that big jumbo jet to move them across the country from evangelism rally to evangelism rally. We don't know if this is fair or unfair, but often it's the misguided few in any profession that affect the opinion of the public in terms of viewing that profession. So maybe those televangelists or those folks that aren't telling the true message are damaging the reputation of the ones that have come to speak the truth and to spread the gospel message. He references here his experiences in Philippi as proof he's not in it for himself. If you go back to Acts chapter 16, you can see he was publicly flogged and placed in stocks, beaten with rods by the Romans as a result of his preaching there, even though he is a Roman citizen. And so he's saying, if I were in it for myself, if I were in it for me, why would I keep speaking out and subjecting myself to this kind of torture or this kind of punishment? So he's here to say we're not hanging our heads in shame. We have courage in God, and we're going to continue to speak truth to power. And there's a sense of boldness and freedom here that I think is very meaningful for us as Christians to think about this courage to declare the gospel, this boldness, this bold speech to speak out and to speak to, the face of opposition, and to say that, this may be what society is telling us, but we know what we need to do, and to speak up and to speak out and to speak for those that probably have no voice, which helps us to build greater community. And then he says, this was not in vain. This was not empty. I had to leave, but my efforts weren't a failure, because look where you are. Look where you are as a church. Look what we were able to do and how you're growing and thriving in the community. And then in verses 3 through 5, he goes on to remind them some things about what he was after when he was there. We didn't have impure motives. There was no deceit. There was nothing we were trying to hide from you. There was no hidden agenda. And I mentioned earlier about the context of Thessalonica as a port city and the diversity that was there. Because of that diversity, there were many religions, many cultures present. And a lot of these religions were missionary-minded. So they might come into a community, try to spread their faith using itinerant evangelists or preachers. And a lot of these false religions were led by these folks who were really opportunists. They were out to take everything they could from their listeners, and then they moved on to find someone else who might support them. And we know those people probably still exist today. But Paul is setting himself apart here. I have no hidden agenda. I'm not out for anything. I'm not one of these traveling preachers who's going to take your money and fill your head with superstitions. I'm not going to be a charlatan to try to win you over and demand some kind of payment or some kind of sacrifice from you, because this is not about me. This is about the message of Christ. One thing that I think is interesting here in reading some commentaries, it says, we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the good news. I think in the message it says, we have been put through a battery of tests. The Roman culture was focused on civil servants and public service. And as a public servant and a civil servant myself, Paul is using a phrase that would have been associated with approving someone as being fit. So we have the fitness to deliver this message. So just as in the Greco-Roman culture, you would have been tested for fitness for service before you became a public servant. We have been tested and commissioned as God's messengers. We are fit for this occupation. And again, we're not after crowd approval. We're after the approval of God himself. We're not going to butter you up with fancy words and nice statements to make you feel good. We're going to tell you the truth. And it talks about in the message, he says, or the phrase that's used, we never used words as a smokescreen to take advantage of you. So we weren't trying to hide our agenda. We weren't trying to alter our message in any way. We were trying to be honest and upfront with you. And then in verses 6 and 7, we really see the heart of Paul's attitude and his style of leadership that is proving to them that his motives were pure. He talks about not seeking glory from men, not making demands. We didn't want to take, but we wanted to give back to you. Isn't that what we want to do as Christians or as a church? We don't want to take, we want to give back, we want to serve folks. And he uses this metaphor about a nursing mother who provides milk for their child. And later he uses a paternal image, a father to children, and that's not in this text. But, that's kind of an odd metaphor, especially when you think about three men who are working on behalf of spreading the gospel message. But the idea is we want to feed you, we want to nourish you, we want to take care of you, just as a mother takes care of her child or her children. So imagine Paul in this image. And then imagine that as a model for Christian servant leadership. Maybe you can imagine a pastor that you've had in the past, a favorite pastor that's maybe meant something especially to you. Or perhaps you can think about Kobe in this way. That he has a goal and a responsibility in his ministry to feed and nourish us as his congregation through preaching and Bible study and worship planning, and especially pastoral care. So this mothering metaphor, to take maybe a note out of Kobe's sermon, brings a spirit of community. As a mother's love for her children runs very deep, Paul and his friends have learned to care for the Thessalonian believers, yearning for them when they were apart, caring in such a way that they were concerned from afar. He really is speaking here, our lives have become intertwined. When I'm not with you, I still feel your heart. And he goes on to say, I've fallen in love with you as a people. In that verse 8, it says, we loved you dearly, not content just to pass on that gospel message. We wanted to give you our hearts, and we did. And isn't that what we want from a pastor or from Christian leaders in our church, whether they be deacons or the prayer team or our fellowship group? We want to share that sense of community. We want to give each other our hearts. We want to become a part of each other's lives. So not only is this a model for Christian servant leadership for clergy, but it's a model for us as a church. We're not just determined to share with you. If you're sitting at home and you don't have a church home, we want to be, First Baptist Church, we want to be a church that doesn't only want to share the gospel message with you, but we want you to become a part of our family, a part of our community. We want to love you. We want to feel your pain and celebrate your joy. So this model, I mentioned earlier, this idea of imitating. Paul is setting this up as an imitation. I do this to you. You should do this to me, and you should do this to each other. So that's a great lesson for us, not only as a body of believers here in our community, but as the larger universal church. That we're not just here to share that gospel message, although that is the foundation of what we're here to do, but we're here to create this community where we care for one another and for those who are not a part of our community. So we see a side of Paul we rarely see. We think about him being a missionary, preaching, traveling, counting his converts. But it's not just about that for him. It's about love and care for the people with whom he gets to work alongside. He wants to see them grow, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to ensure their survival and encourage their development. He cares for them. just like a parent would for a child. So, as I said, and I think this is important, and if you watch Spiritual Formation on Wednesday, you'll be reminded of this because the passage in Deuteronomy, Kobe and Sean spoke specifically about Christian leadership. But I think this, as I've mentioned, gives us a lot to think about and a lot to chew on about what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a Christian leader, whether that's in a sacred setting, serving in the church, or whether it's in a secular setting, moving outside of the church and being a Christian in the secular world. You can Google or go on Amazon and find a lot of books, a lot of titles on leadership, or even beyond that about Christian leadership. And, we need to think about this text as a guide for us about what a Christian leader looks like. And maybe you can come up with some descriptors, some adjectives, some qualities that you think a Christian leader should possess. And if you want to share those in the comments, that would be great. But I think there are some unique qualities that Christian leaders possess. And I think we need to be thinking about how we can manifest those qualities in our own life. And I think we also need to think about putting the needs of others before our own. I think that's one of the key qualities of a Christian leader. Seeking to encourage growth in faith. And I think that provides a sense of hope, not only for our congregation, but for the greater universal church. As long as we are possessing that leadership and mentoring others and seeing those patterns in those mentors that we have or passing those on, that helps to secure the perpetuity of the greater universal church and our church here at First Baptist. So I want you to think about, maybe you attended our church, maybe you don't, but who are some servant leaders at First Baptist? I want you to think about who those people are. When you think about servant leadership, who do you think about? And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Maybe you go to another church. I'd love to hear who those people are. Or maybe it's someone you attended church with in the past. Think about those people. Think about what they do as a part of their leadership and their service. And think about how they care for others, how they manifest that care and love, how they show that. And then I want you to think about, do their actions make you want to be more like them? And I think that's a rhetorical question. I think the answer is yes. We should see those qualities, just like I mentioned, that idea of imitating and mirroring one another. We should want those qualities to be mirrored and reflected. And as Kobe used this phrase last week in his sermon, and to ricochet throughout our church and throughout our community and throughout our world. So this week I just want to encourage you to seriously consider what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a Christian leader, and specifically how this text gives us a great example of how we can manifest that in our own life. As Paul says, we don't want to have a hidden agenda. We've been entrusted with the gospel. We've passed that test. And we never want to use words as a smokescreen to take advantage of people. And we don't want to throw our weight around just because we've been entrusted with this special gift. We should never want to come across as important, as the text says, and we don't want to be aloof. We don't want to patronize people. We don't want to condescend them because we maybe know something that they don't. We don't want to feel like that. We want to care for people. We want to care for people the way that a nursing mother cares for her children. And we want to provide that community here at First Baptist to the point where we're not just here to pass on the gospel message, but where we can give our hearts to each other. And I think we do that, and I want us to continue to do that. If you will, before we depart, if you'll pray with me. Lord, thank you for this other opportunity that we have each Sunday morning to be together. We're so blessed to be able to gather in your house, although it may be distanced currently. And this is just another way for us to connect as a community, as a body of believers, and to reach not only people who are regularly within our walls, but to reach those who are outside of our walls. We want them to know that the door is always open, that we have pure motives and we have no hidden agenda other than to share the gospel message and to love them and care for them and to grow in a community of faith and a body of believers in a way that we're able to give our hearts to one another. Remind us of this model of Christian leadership that is mentioned in this text Help us to realize this doesn't just apply to clergy and those who are in leadership positions in our church, but that we're called to imitate this model and to provide that kind of leadership so that we can shine brightly in our community and let people know that we're here to love them, just as Paul loved the Thessalonians. I ask all these things in your name.